out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to La Pausa, our laid-back saunter through the history of South American football. And welcome, like I said, to for those who've been listening to this series already, this was the one I was looking forward to the most, because this is Encounters of the Third Kind. And I can only ever say this at the beginning of this episode. So before we go into detail with regards this particular episode, first of all, I'd like to introduce my co-compadres for this episode. So first of all, Mr. Gary Thacker. Gary, welcome.
Yeah, great to be back on the South America Files trail once more. And we're going to be talking about, probably the first dominant team in world football.
Excellent. We absolutely are. There will certainly be a thread that runs through this episode. Stephen, welcome to this. Massively looking forward to it.
Massively looking forward to it. I've got 5 of the best Argentinian players you could possibly look for a five-a-side team. And there's just no way in the world that anyone's going to beat my selections.
Excellent. Brilliant. Well done. Thank you. And with no further ado, to sort all this out and explain how that all works and fits together nicely, Dr. P, that PhD of yours is going to really come in useful right this minute.
Yeah, I know. All 3 of those letters are really going to be tested to their limits. Yeah, no, looking forward to this one. I think that's very much a trademark kind of statement of of each episode. But yeah, tonight we're going to, explore further into the kind of encounters between Europe and South America with the aim to discuss basically a team that Jonathan Wilson in his excellent book, Angels with Dirty Faces, described as a team who left as unknowns and then came back and having redefined football. So yeah, that's the aim for tonight.
That's no small claim. That feels like quite a lot of pressure to talk about a subject. So we're going to look at 1924, 1928 Olympic Games, the football competition within those, and then we're also going to look at the 1930 World Cup. So obviously today, while I was thinking about this, guys, what I thought we'd do is we would go through tournament by tournament, and we'll look at each tournament, which obviously will culminate certainly in the move away from the Olympic Games being seen as the de facto World Championship competition to the actual FIFA-led World Cup. But how that change didn't really lead to a change in success or a dominant nation in any way. But obviously massively South American influence, which obviously we'll get into. So Pete, I'll let you go first. We'll start with sort of the, not necessarily the lead up to the 1924 Olympics, but obviously where we've been so far has very much been club side driven. Oh, by the way, how are the tour T-shirts coming on, by the way, from the first 2 episodes? I forgot to ask in the intro.
Yeah, still waiting to hear back from Rampler Juniors to see if they've got on the blower to see if they can sort us out with the jacket and T-shirt combo. So they're the ones I'm hoping for. I think Colo Colo will probably have a fairly nifty kind of Mapuche type symbol, with their kind of rocking around Europe as well. So, still waiting for the phone call to come in from the clubs.
Excellent. And I know Stephen's put in a special Sash Request tour T-shirt, which is fine. I'm sure that'll be done.
The Boca prop bag is coming on very, very nicely indeed. It's got the full extendable ladder. It's got the lampshade, the big lamp stand. It's got absolutely everything you could possibly wish for, and so much more.
If you're wondering where that reference comes from, please see the anecdote section in episode 2, which I will be revealing, by the way, the winner of last week's anecdote competition, so we can update the scores. But that'll be done as we come to this episode's anecdote. But yeah, so we've looked at the clubs. We looked at English clubs coming across, and then clubs from Europe coming to South America, and what South American clubs could learn. Last episode we looked at sort of the reverse of that, and South America clubs going across to Europe and some of those tours that were made. And now we sort of, I suppose we see the not necessarily the outcome, because that sounds quite twee, but the impact that the development of football within South America, and certainly as an international football, and where that left the sort of the major powerhouses of South American football. So, Pete, really, first of all, it's not necessarily the lead up to the 24 Olympics, I suppose, to begin with, just the development and progression of international football at this point.
Yeah, so I think that, what you've had currently in Latin America anyway is a starting point of international relations. Uruguay and Argentina have already started to play each other very regularly. There have been a variety of cup competitions, the Lipton Cup being one of the first ones, that was there, to become a source of national pride, of play between the two neighbours of the River Plate. And I think really when you start getting the club teams, from the mighty Southampton to the some of the other teams, the lesser lights of Nottingham Forest and Spurs and Everton, coming across where they start to kind of get an idea of football really being something that can provide meeting place for a lot more nations, and I think that the, travel communication is starting to facilitate that. But really within Latin America, it really starts to take place around 1916, which is when the first kind of South American Championship occurs. And then this starts to be quite a regular event. We're really looking at it being kind of the Southern Cone teams that are participating, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Chile really are the ones that are there and starting to become involved. And what's apparent early on is that these accrue a great deal of national importance. We've already talked in the first episode about how presidents and important figures of the elite society are watching these games, and the press are doing the same thing. And again, we see the development of a sporting press that begins to talk very much about national pride, about national identity through these team performances in sport. And then, so what you also have is, these nations are looking to start to connect to Europe, and go to Europe as well. And I think this is around the idea of creating sporting international confederations. We've already had the Olympics being established. CONMEBOL, or the origins of the South American Football Federation, is established again very shortly, around about the same time as the first South American Championship. We also have FIFA being organised as well. So the South American nations are starting to look to be able to participate in these first Olympic Games. This is something they see that they need to do in order to create the image of themselves as participating actively in a modern cultural and sporting community. So, for the first few championships, they're aware of what's going on. They're hearing the reports, but there's not really any representation of any extent. And then really when 1924 comes around, we see the first real serious intent of, both Argentina and Uruguay to start with, to actually compete. As we'll probably go on to, only one of them will actually go for various reasons. But we do see Argentina competing in various other sports in the 1924 Olympics, although they're not there for the football. They win the gold medal in the polo, for example. They do very well in boxing. They also get a medal in athletics. So we see this kind of start of participation in international sport, and that is very much seen as being, the desire to be part of a growing modern international community. And that is also kind of involved in joining the organisations. One of the things that's interesting about this Olympic Games is that Uruguay only actually joined FIFA in 1923, only a year before the Olympics, and actually keep it secret. And again, we'll probably go into that in a little bit of detail, why this particular facet is kept secret. But that's what we're looking at, a kind of a look to expand, a look to join Europe, and a look to demonstrate their own kind of sporting participation, buoyed with some confidence about having competed quite well against certainly some of the British teams that had come over, and also some of the European teams that had also toured in the early 1920s.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for that sort of that lead up to the competition. Gary, before we get into the competition, it's worth pointing out that certainly in episode 1, it was very much a what can South America learn? South America looking to soak up like a sponge any technical elements. We talked a little bit about the science of football at the time, and yet unbelievably, you have what we know as the Copa America, but the South American Championships 44 years before the Euros start. And it's that leap of development, that ambition, that, as people were just talking about, that desire to be seen and acknowledged and recognized on a global scale. Everything moves at such a pace in South American football?
I guess this. We looked at the tours, the British clubs tours to South America. When you put in context what happened afterwards, the tournaments that Uruguay began to dominate 24-28 in 1930. And you sort of put those two alongside, Uruguay and in fact Argentina, because Argentina were very competitive all this period as well. How much the game kicked on so quickly on international terms, and having the Sudamericano in well set, they had international competition probably well established well before that happened in Europe. As you mentioned, the European Championship didn't start till 1960. So yeah, I think that gave a lot of an impetus to the development of the international scene in South America.
And as well, Stephen, with you, again, we talk about, the establishment of the CONMEBOL and, compared to the establishment, of UEFA, again, the administration side, it's not only the playing side, but that administration side, that underpinning of, I don't want to call it a product, but almost the underpinning of the product that was at the time international football in South America. That's also in place almost in advance, talking about in advance of FIFA, etc. They are ahead of the game.
They are. I mean, what's great for them is that they start with a blank piece of paper, basically, as far as, setting out the pan-South American, ideals and being able to put together a rudimentary Copa America from 1917, as Gary said. It's not till 1960 that UEFA managed to follow suit with a European version of it. So yes, while there is still that class divide between the upper classes, the middle classes, the working classes that you can see run throughout each city via the teams, be it student affiliated teams, the incoming British, and then the next generation kind of like keep that stiff upper lip to the credentials and all of that. When push comes to shove, when it comes to an administrative situation, I think they're blessed by having that total blank piece of paper and being so far away from the power base of the UK, of Europe. So you've got this kind of like, it's like a third footballing world, but it's the third footballing world that shows how it should be done in terms of putting a spectacle on. And then in Uruguay, they clearly go on to show just what they could do with a football as well. So not only are they doing it on the pitch, they're doing it off the pitch as well.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a quick question, Pete, before we start to move on to the Olympics. And this almost underpinning development of the game, obviously compared to as Stephen alluded to there, is a little bit sort of the English and very UK sort of, it was almost like, well, that won't teach us anything. We already know how to administer a game. We also, it was almost like it was resistance to change because the change was being brought by South America rather than by Europe, or certainly by the FA at that time. Is that a fair point, or is it just we were lazy?
No, I think it's a very fair point. I think there is a certain amount of, again, we talked a lot about the continental hierarchy within Latin America and those episodes we did in Series 1 or 2. I think you can see a similar hierarchy between the old world of Europe, the kind of colonial masters, and the kind of old savages of the kind of global south of the new world. I think that idea of how can these kind of barbaric figures, and again, I'm kind of exaggerating here, but there is a little bit of this, of the racial, of the power hierarchies that assumes that Europe is far in advance of knowledge of Latin America, certainly Africa, but Latin America wouldn't be far above that. We're not looking at a continent that has provided global figures of culture previously. We don't have authors, we don't have composers, we don't have great world leaders. We have a few, independence leaders. But a lot of the old images of, the empire are certainly very prevalent. Britain obviously still has a lot of its empire, even though, Portugal, is another country that still will. France will still have its own empire. So these kind of ideas are still prevalent. So I think there is a kind of a power divide, and a power that, the kind of modernizers in Europe are unwilling to give over. I mean, certainly, we'll get on to the 1930 World Cup eventually, but in lots of ways, the hosting of the 1930 World Cup in Uruguay is seen as almost being a coup. And it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of the European nations don't want to go to travel to South America. It's somehow beneath them for this pinnacle of the global sporting event to be held somewhere other than Europe, or maybe, North America. I think what's also important as well, though, is also to look at the reasons why South America, might have been facilitated in terms of establishing its own organizations and ability to organize tournaments quite successfully. I think you look at a kind of common heritage to start with, in that we have a common language that facilitates communication. Obviously Brazil is slightly different, but it's not a million miles away in terms of being able to communicate with Uruguay, with Argentina, for example. I think that also there is, again, I think the timing is important. We're looking at really around about the centenary of a lot of these Latin American nations' independence, which happens really, most of the independence movements are starting in, the early 1800s. The wars are occurring in the 1810s. I think Uruguay's, finally, their independence is ratified by a constitution in 1830. But by then, most of the nations become independent. So they're starting to analyse themselves and look at a current common heritage and say, what did we all experience? What can we all learn? And there is a kind of a slight trend of Pan-Americanism in Latin American thought that's going on, looking at, the continent of Americas as sharing a common heritage. And therefore, perhaps there is some instinct to look to collectivize or to maybe establish the kind of organizations that might potentially challenge, some of the European powers. I think certainly you can see that in the alliance that leads to, winning, or Uruguay winning the 1930 World Cup. Right, there is a kind of an alliance of Latin American nations that probably see themselves as brothers in arms in many ways, sharing a kind of common chance to present Latin America as something important in a kind of world in which they've often felt very inferior.
It is a fascinating. We've talked about this before about the loss of, or the potential loss of, these stories and these sort of the narrative that forms the beginnings of the game, and certainly the beginnings of the international game. You look at what the World Cup's like now, and the European Championships, and how, they are classed as mega events. And I know we're talking about the Olympics, etc., but Gary, something that I wasn't fully aware of, and that was at this point, so the 24 Olympics are in Paris, but I didn't realize that at this point FIFA organise the Olympic competitions. It's almost like favors for a mate. It's like, you're a football organization. Would you do this bit for us? And yet it takes sort of 6 years, and there are discussions earlier, but FIFA are sort of organising what is essentially their competition for another organisation.
I guess it was a bit of a symbiotic relationship between, because both FIFA and the Olympics games gave each other a little bit of extra credibility. And I think I'm right in saying by 1928, a third of the revenue for the Olympic Games came from the football tournament. Now, I mean, at that stage, you can see where FIFA are thinking, hello, guys, we don't need these guys anymore. I mean, it's one of those sort of relationships, in any situation, there's always one business model doing better out of a merger than t'other. And I think FIFA realised very quickly that, they could kick on their own financially without the Olympics. But yeah, I guess it was quite strange. But there again, I guess even to this day, the Olympics are in sort of cahoots with the IAAF, the International Amateur Athletic Federation, as well, and other organisations that organise sport. So it perhaps wasn't that unusual, but it's interesting that once the football tournament proves so successful financially, perhaps more than anything else, as well as in popularity terms, it was inevitable FIFA were going to say, we've outgrown this model now. Let's go and which is exactly what they did. They took their own tournament.
Stephen, will our main sort of point of topic here is South America, and we'll come to Uruguay's performance, Uruguay's place in these first two Olympics, and certainly in this first 1924 Olympics in Paris. But it's interesting to note the nations that participate in this 1924 Olympic competition alongside Uruguay. You look at the nations that are competing, and there's a fair showing of Eastern European nations. Obviously, England choose not to go, and you also have the United States of America. In terms of it being relatively global, it's not a bad attempt But it's there are certainly some what we would call class as traditional football powerhouses, but there are also nations there that you probably wouldn't expect at a major football competition in its infancy.
Absolutely. I mean, you can look at it's quite groundbreaking in that respect when you're looking at Egypt being there, you're looking at Estonia before they're absorbed into what would be the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia putting their own teams out, Luxembourg are there. And that was all. It's always been the great thing about the Olympics is that you get a lot of nations who you just wouldn't see in a World Cup, and that was one of the great things. An Irish Free State side. It just looks magnificently eclectic and a little bit esoteric. Certainly in terms of how we have viewed World Cups and European Championships in our lifetime. These look quite jarring in some respects, but you see these teams and you think, I mean, Egypt, they were meant to be at the 1930 World Cup, but literally missed the boat. They were meant to be the 14th team, literally missed the boat. They got held up on the first leg of their journey to Uruguay and had to call it off. And within that, you have that, as you say, that hand in hand with the powerhouses, the great and the good there as well. France, the great underachievers, yet the innovators in pretty much everything when it comes to football in terms of being the ones with the bright ideas, and the glaring mission is obviously the British, as they usually are. But yeah, that 1924 lineup of teams is absolutely magnificent. Interestingly, Spain are in there as well, and Sweden, nations that wanted to host the 1930 World Cup, yet missed out to Uruguay, and then subsequently they decided not to take part in 1930. We're not up for travelling to Uruguay, despite having shown this interest in being the host nation of that first World Cup. So yeah, it's an interesting mix of a proper eclectic mix that you want to know more when you see that lineup of teams.
Gary, I mean, before we're going to ask Pete for the lowdown on Uruguay and Uruguay's arrival at this competition, but there's even Luxembourg are there now. For as long as I've watched football, Luxembourg have always been the bottom seed in a qualifying group, and that's all you ever see and hear of them. And yet here they are, sort of groundbreaking at the sort of the birth of it's not the birth of modern football, but certainly as football starts to explode on an international scale, they're right there. They're right at the forefront, along with, like Stephen said, Estonia and Lithuania. It is a random collection who decided to put forward football teams for this competition.
I was just going to say, well, interestingly, that the four European nations that do actually go to Uruguay are also there as well as part of that. So that melting pot of teams at the 1924 Olympics is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so just saying none of the home nations were there, and England had won the Olympic football tournament a couple of times in the early part of the 20th century. But the big thing was that in the early 20s, football associations in Europe began to sort of ease the definition of amateurism. The Belgians in 1921 started saying that they were going to allow payments for players for time lost from work. And then others followed. Switzerland followed, and Italy followed, and this became a big thing for the English FA. And they made a statement said that any player registered with this association receiving remuneration of any sort other than necessary expenses shall be considered to be a professional. So there's no way that the reason that the home nations didn't go, and as I say, that's the FA, but the Scottish FA, the Welsh FA, and the Irish FA as well at the same time, were very much sort of die-hard. Amateurism should be Olympics, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it always will be. So that's the reason that England opted out. But it did give a lot of options to other teams to perhaps puncture the sort of hubris of the British.
Pete, I'm gonna ask you about obviously Uruguay and their participation in this competition, and the more you look. I mean, obviously hindsight's a great thing, isn't it? But the more you look at this lineup of teams, the more Uruguay become almost the inevitable winners, which is easy to say now in retrospect, clearly. But you look at it and Uruguay just stand out as a glaringly one of the obvious favourites for this competition. But that's clearly based on what we know and what's to come. But a question for you is, we're going to go through these 3 tournaments from 24 to 30, which is essentially a 6-year span. Now, to me, as I've learned about the history of the game, and you have the Dutch 74, 78, you have Brazil 70, you have Hungary, maybe now Spain in that 3 major tournament. And there is a nod to the Austrian Wunder team. But do you think this 6-year span, this 6-year dominance, for want of a better word, is grossly under celebrated in terms of its impact on the game, the same as maybe those other ones that have been mentioned?
I think it depends on where you're looking. It's certainly not under-celebrated in Uruguay.
But in terms of, I would agree with, in terms of how we look at, like I say, I've not mentioned England in that list of great teams, because I don't believe we've ever had a truly great side, or a side that has changed the way the game is played, or maybe that's what these teams have done, the Dutch and the Spanish.
I think you have
Hungarians.
I completely agree. I think you have to put Uruguay in that bracket, and it's not just happening in the tournaments. I mean, you judge the best teams in the world by their medals. Show me your medals. This team, won everything there was to win. They won the Copa America in 1923. Before that as well. I think it's something like they'd won the Copa America 5 out of the previous 6 versions before 1924. Again, I might be wrong. I'll probably get a host of angry messages from Argentinian fans about that. But Uruguay really are setting the tone. And I think what's very important is that it's the way they play as well, is that they certainly change the way football should be played, or how it's perceived about how it could be played in Europe. I think one of the things that a lot of the writing on this in South America, particularly Uruguay, points out is the impact it has abroad, because Latin America tends to look abroad for vindication, for validation, for approval. It's almost like this, we know you are our colonial masters. So if you are telling us that we're really good, then we really believe it. And some of the words that are used to describe the Uruguayan team by the French journalists particularly, which are quoted in lots of history books about world football, from the Tony Mason book, the Andreas Campomar book, David Goldblatt, are looking to French journalists and seeing what they're saying. And what they're saying is, this team is teaching us to play. This is showing us a different way to play. So a lot of those people who say, the Uruguayan game is based on the English game or the Scottish game, or both, I think you have to add in that it's hybridized with its own creativity as well. There is a kind of something that Uruguayans are bringing to that football as well. Because if they are producing a football which, the French, the Dutch, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, are all claiming as being marvelous, as being, wonderful, as being new, then there must be something that the Uruguayans have brought into it as well, and the Argentinians as well, because, similar things are said about, their teams as well in a similar generation. But, you have to look at Uruguay as being, one of the great generations of world football. They have to be, because they win it. I mean, I think a lot of the time we make apologies by saying, British football was probably the best at that time. Well, it might be, but if you're not prepared to go, if you're not prepared to travel, then you're cowards. It's that. If you're not prepared to put it on the line, that's tough. You can't claim to be the best if you don't want to put it out there. They did. Some of the other great nations at the time were there. Italy, Spain, Germany, France, Netherlands. They're there, and Uruguay are beating them. So they have to be up there as one of the great sides of history.
Gary Pete makes a great point there. I don't think I know of anybody who would consider England, the England national team of the early, late 20s, early 30s to be the greatest team in the world. I wouldn't even think they're even remotely considered, for the very reason that Pete's just mentioned then. They were brave to do it, and they travelled, twice. We look at the next Olympics when we come to it in Amsterdam. They travel across the Atlantic twice to stake that claim for gold medals at the Olympics. And they did it, and they achieve it, and they achieve it in the World Cup in 1930. Not only were they brave enough to go, but on top of that, they then actually win all 3 competitions as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was reading up this morning. I think I'm right in saying that this when they travelled to Europe, was the first time Uruguay played outside of South America. and they travelled on third-class steamer to get there and played a mini tour in Spain ahead of the games to pay for the passage. I mean, now that's when Pete said that England had a bottle job not travelling, and I certainly. Uruguay, you couldn't celebrate Uruguay because they put themselves on offer by being the only South America. They beat Argentina in the, and Pete mentioned earlier, in the 1923 Sudamericano to qualify. And as one of the goals there was scores a guy called Petrone who crops up quite a bit in the next couple of tournaments as well. And you wonder, because Argentina was so close to Uruguay in all these tournaments coming up, 28 and 1930, Argentina lost in the finals, both those tournaments. If Argentina had gone as well, I mean, who would say that South America would have been first and second? Because Uruguay was obviously a successful team. And it's interesting you mentioned that their success from 1924 to 1930. They actually didn't get beat in a global tournament until 1954, and then they only lost to the Great Hungarian side. If they'd have beat Hungary in that, I think it was quarter-final, who knows? They could have gone on and added another 4 years to it. So I know they didn't travel to Europe in 34 and 38, but there were justifiable reasons for that. But I mean, the Uruguayan team were they were without doubt the finest team in the world at that stage, and England can say what they damn well like, and I'm sorry guys, as Pete says, you've got to be in it to win it, and England didn't even bother to turn up and tried to live on their reputation that was tainted by every time they didn't turn up for competitions.
Stephen, I'm not even going to remotely open the can of worms that would be discussing England's fear of turning up at these major competitions and the reasons why. But I mean, you can have your say if you want. I feel like it might be another blankety blank ITV 1984 Euro rant, and I'm not sure we've got enough time for that. However, it does sort of reinforce something that you talk about a lot in terms of looking outward rather than looking inward, and this is probably the best example of a nation looking outwards in terms of its football development, in terms of what it can achieve, how it can place itself, within the, well, I suppose, on the planet, where it ranks itself, where it sees itself, and how the world sees it, purely because it is brave enough and is prepared to look outward rather than almost convince themselves inwardly that they don't need to do it because everyone just knows that we're the best, but we don't actually want to prove it.
From an English perspective, this is just put a penny in and then off we go.
I've allowed time for it. Don't worry.
That English and Scottish sense of superiority is truly massive in this respect, and it's a proper juxtaposition to what Uruguay do over this period of time. What you've got is that England and Scotland feeling like they are the owners of the game. So you've got that kind of the game was invented in England, but then the Scots showed the English how to do it. Because the Scottish players were so vaunted in the 1890s, and Liverpool's first team known as the Team of Max because we brought 11 Scotsmen down to put a team together, and all of that. Scottish players so influential in the early expanses of football all over the world. We've shown that in previous South America file series. So you've got that kind of one-upmanship between the English and the Scottish, but then combined, the two of them kind of like look down the nose at the rest of Europe. But then you've got Europe looking down their nose. It's again, Pete's brought it up before. It's that classic sketch. John Cleese, it's Ronnie Corbett, it's Ronnie Barker. The three of them all just stood there together. So you've got this kind of knock-on effect, domino effect. England and Scotland fighting out for superiority. We're better than everyone else. Who are these Europeans think they are? They're trying to play this game that we've invented. But then you've got kind of like the South Americans. But the South Americans great because they have that. Yes, there is that hierarchical system that we've spoken of so many times, but there is also that blank sheet of paper. They pick up the tools of the game, and then they show and find a better way of doing it. So it's kind of like, well, the school teacher who kind of like does the art class, but then there's the precocious kid who picks up exactly the same implements and makes something far more beautiful than the teacher does. And this is what Uruguay are doing at this point in time, to the point that Gary's brought him up, Petroni. He plays as an advanced centre forward, which is kind of like against the scriptures of the game at that point in time. And when he goes over and scores all these goals in the 1924, Olympic Games, the rest of Europe picks up on it and says, "Hang on a minute, we need to be doing that with our players." And then suddenly that's where you've got Dixie Dean starting to kind of like come into the equation. If you think about it, prior to Dixie Dean and that generation of emblematic goal scorers, there isn't really that cachet of British strikers that are so, celebrated prior to that. It's this influence. So what you've got is just this, it all just, the British way of doing it, basically it's like they've thrown out a boomerang to the rest of the world to say we've invented football, and it comes back and hits them like 3 decades later.
Okay. So we've got the two Ronnies and a boomerang as our analogy to the English perception of football. I knew I could rely on you, Stephen.
Absolutely, and still they remain the Dick Dastardly of the sea.
Yeah, still, Pete. We'll come to the 24 Olympics. Feel free to talk us through Uruguay's performance. It's in Paris. We mentioned that Stephen's very eloquently talked us through the sides that were there, and and highlighted sort of some of the sides that were there. But it's a pretty serene progression up until you reach the semi-finals, where it starts to get a little bit trickier. But realistically, it is probably only the semi-finals where there's any real resistance.
Yeah, and I think this actually surprises the Uruguayans themselves as well. I think that. You said in a previous question, we almost assume Uruguay would win. They certainly didn't think that. There's a guy called Aldo Mazzucchelli who's written a really good book, Del Ferroviario al Tango. And he talks about, he's looked at the newspapers and there isn't this sense of confidence in the team. And actually, they're actually quite lucky to even be there. There is a schism in Uruguayan football, as there is in Argentinian football. So, the Uruguayans are actually not sending their best side out. And something that a lot of people I don't think know is that you assume that, Uruguay are sending everyone that can play, all their best players there. They're not. There is not a single player from Peñarol there, because Peñarol are on the other side of the schism. The team that go out are Nacional, and the team that are the other teams that are in the Nacional Association, the AUF, whereas the other side, the FUF sides, are not there. So just imagine how good they could have been if everyone had gone. And actually the same thing happens in Argentina, in that there is a schism there as well. There are two football federations fighting for power. Then there is a kind of power struggle as well with the Argentine Olympic Committee, to the extent where the elites, and it's the same in Uruguay, both the elites are fighting over for control of the game and what side is actually representative. And in Argentina's case, they mess it up, they screw it up. The IOC finally says, you can't send a team out, don't bother now, it's too late, you can't do it. Uruguay are only lucky because they joined FIFA secretly in 1923 through a diplomat called Enrique Buero, who's an extremely significant figure in the whole process of the early years of FIFA and why it ends up going to Uruguay in 1930. But basically, someone had said, well, we'll join FIFA as the AUF, so we will have the accreditation. So if we then go to the Olympic Games and the other federation tries to scupper us, we can say, well, we're the accredited one through FIFA and therefore through the Olympic Games Committee. And even though the other organisation are trying to stop them going because the team have already left, because there is this guy called Enrique Buero in Europe, he is able to make sure they do play. So they nearly don't even make it in the first place. So they're the kind of caveats that show that Uruguay was certainly not predestined to win. But but once they do get there, they have pretty much a perfect competition. They start not actually very auspiciously. One of the interesting facts about this is there's a silk scarf made for all the nations that are competing in the Olympic Games. And Uruguay isn't even on it. They forget to put the Uruguayan flag on it. So you can imagine that creates a bit of a kind of nationalistic disgrace to start with. And then the first game that they're playing, which I think is against Yugoslavia, hardly anyone's there in the first place. There's something like 3,000 people there, which is one of the lowest attendances for that competition. And, Uruguay put on a bit of a show. They win 7-0. There's a lovely anecdote that apparently the Yugoslavians had sent some spies to watch the Uruguayan training session. And apparently Galliano, and I'm going to talk a lot about Eduardo Galliano, who describes these legends in a great deal of detail. He says, the Uruguayans caught on and practiced by kicking the ground and sending the ball into the clouds, tripping at every step and crashing into each other. So they kind of fooled the Yugoslavs and then won 7-0. And then word starts to spread. The USA are dispatched fairly comfortably 3-1. And again, this is where we start to see this style of play as becoming really important and different. There's a quote that says, a style of play never seen before and not bettered by anyone. That's after the USA game. The really big game is against France. You can imagine that most of the attention of the games is on this match. Uruguay is starting to create a spectacle. The home team are playing. It's in the Colombe Stadium. We have a huge crowd of well over 30,000 there. The French realise after they've been beaten 5-1 that they've been completely outclassed. And this is where we start to see quotes like from Henri de Montalon, who says, it was a revelation. Here we have real football. Compared with this, what we knew before, what we played was no more than a schoolboy's hobby. So that creates the impact. And when they get to the semi-finals, they meet Netherlands. This is the hardest game of the competition. They're losing 1-0 at half-time. Then they get a slightly controversial penalty, which creates a lot of resentment with the Netherlands that will last not only till 1925, when a lot of the Dutch teams don't want to host Nacional, who are on tour in 1925, but also in 1928, when again they will be playing in the Dutch home Olympic Games of 1928. There's this dodgy penalty, and then Seya will then score Seya will score the first goal, and then Scaloni will score the second one. The final is pretty much a fairly easy game. They beat Switzerland 3-0. There's another bit of Dutch rivalry here, is that originally was going to be a Dutch referee doing the final. The Uruguayan team said no because they were afraid about being prejudiced. So Marcel Slavic of France ends up being the referee, and it's a fairly competent 3-0 win. Again, we can talk about the reactions and why it matters, but I think what's really important is that they wow the crowds, they wow the press. The narratives are all about this unheard of nation, this unheard of style of play that becomes a public spectacle and arguably leads to some of the players becoming, possibly some of the first globally acknowledged stars of the game. This is certainly something that Jonathan Wilson talks about. I think it is about someone like, Jose Andrade, who I'm sure we'll talk about, becoming the first global superstar of world football. Maybe global superstar is slightly exaggerated, but, he was obviously well known in South America. He becomes well known in France and in Europe as well. He gets even more well known on the tour that follows. So all these things are really important. It's not just about football. It's about putting Uruguay on the map and putting it on the map in a very distinctive and a spectacular style that creates narratives of world-leading quality.
That was brilliant, Pete, by the way. I just thought I'd share that with you. Gary, when Pete talks like that and uses, the sources to back it up, press quotes, etc., it really, it's something that I mentioned earlier, it really emphasizes how important these stories are to bring them to the younger generation, to make sure they don't disappear, to make sure that, people are aware of the history of the game, but of the global history of the game, and not and I know we're all English and we live in England. You can't help what's come before, but it's so important that the true and complete history of the game is remembered and written.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, not only did Uruguay travel to Europe to win the Olympic title, and they didn't scrape it either. I mean, the Dutch game that Pete mentioned was the only game where they didn't sort of, I wouldn't say canter, but sort of ease to victory. And I mentioned Petrone earlier, and he scored a brace in the first game. He scored another brace against America. He scored a brace against France. In fact, the only game where it was a struggle, he didn't score in, which is the Dutch game, and he scored in the final as well. And this was probably, a world star. This guy was 19 at the time. I mentioned he scored in the final of the Sudamericano the year before, just 18, and eventually, he eventually played a season in Italy in the early 30s, just after the World Cup, and for Fiorentina, and scored 37 goals in just 44 games for Fiorentina. He was timed apparently very quick. He timed for just a dab over 11 seconds for 100 metres, which, that's pretty tasty, especially going back, to the 1930s. And it's still, I believe this is, it was when I looked it up, on the article I looked it up, but I think he's still the youngest football Olympic gold medalist, 19 years old and 1 month, having netted 7 times. And there's, Uruguay would only understand, but they're an outstanding goal scorer as well.
Stephen, I don't even know if this is the right question to ask, but I'm just going to ask you it anyway because it's where you sat on my screen, so it's just your turn, and that's how it is. If you can just tell me in 2 minutes why these names that Gary's just mentioned there, and and Pete mentioned there, these first, for want of a better word, these first global superstars. And you talked about Dixie Dean, but to me, and I can only talk for myself, but it's really my conscious of footballers and what I would call global superstars and global icons really start with that Hungarian side and not with this Uruguayan side. And my question there is why? Why, Stephen? Why? In 2
The
minutes.
1954. Okay, I'll try and keep it to 2 minutes. The 1954 World Cup is literally the first one that's broadcast, live as it happens. From a UK perspective, you could, people who had a television could sit and watch the games. Not all of them. They were the games that were selected, but because Hungary was so.
Is that because Blankety Blank was also on the other channel? They couldn't watch it.
They hadn't thought of Blankety Blank yet, and actually at this point in time there was probably only one channel, so you were literally a captive audience. So you'd also had all the Hovenbeg games, kind of like against Wolves, etc. And so this Hungarian side wasn't just a case of myth. It wasn't just a case of a paragraph in the Times. It wasn't just a case of word of mouth or any of that. It wasn't just a case of the record books. Here was a team that suddenly you could see at least flashes of them. And to go along with an era in which football journalism has expanded massively. The growth of the tabloids as well. So there's greater scrutiny, but it does come down to that fact that there's just greater access to them.
I was hoping for something more than that, but you are actually just right. That is exactly it. Pete, we're gonna sort of obviously there's 4 years between 24 and 28. Like you've said before, Uruguay are coming back across the Atlantic. They're coming back to Europe to defend this Olympic crown. Argentina sort of also make this journey, and again, there's some of the teams are very similar to the previous Olympics. There are some newer nations in terms of or different nations, should I say, from those who were there at 24. But it's now become almost, and you look at the way the tournament pans out, you look at almost like 2 halves of the draw, and this is now becoming a South American pincer movement, for want of a better word, on the competition.
Yeah, no, it definitely does, and I think that it's what Uruguay do is that they galvanize Argentina into further action. There is a sense of national disappointment that they weren't there. There's a very good article by a guy called Cesar Torres called "If We Had Our Argentine Team Here: Football in the 1924 Argentine Olympics." Because the elites are seen as messing it up, because they didn't manage to set a team. Argentina feels let down. They feel that they should have beaten Uruguay. Again, we've talked about how Argentina sees itself as being the older and better and bigger brother than Uruguay, because Uruguay was once part of Argentina effectively. So there is a sense of Argentina needing to compete to beat the efforts of Uruguay. They actually do it straight after the 1924 World Cup. Some of the Argentine players, kind of resent the fact they weren't there. The goalkeeper Tesorieri talks about how he would have been loved to that, how he'd been loved to be at the Olympics, but how he feels very, very proud of Uruguay, how he somehow feels it's a real Platense triumph. And a lot of the newspapers talk about that as well. And actually, Argentina demand a kind of a two-leg game against Uruguay to see if they actually are better. And this is these are two very, very hard-fought games. There's a 1-1 draw in Montevideo. And then Argentina, the first game's called off after 5 minutes because, there's too many crowd there. They can't hold them back. They're on the pitch. Uruguay players are worried about their safety. And the next game is where we see, the start of the barriers and the barbed wire fences. This is the start of it. 1924. The excitement of the World Cup and the rivalry between Argentina and Uruguay is what leads to the barriers that are still present in Argentinian stadiums these days, where you see the kind of the fans climbing up the fences. This is why they're there, because the 1924 Olympics. It's worth saying that Argentina do win that second game, although the match finishes a little bit early. Scaroni is arrested by a policeman. One of the Uruguayan players breaks an Argentinian player's leg, and actually Onsari scores the first ever goal direct from a corner, the first goal Olímpico. Another kind of importance of this tournament, of the Olympic Games, is then Onsari's goal, although it doesn't occur in the Olympics, is seen as being Olympics. It's even better than the people who were in the Olympics. And again, another little tradition that's linked to the Olympics, by the way, is the Vuelta Olímpica, the kind of Olympic tour. The idea of going around the pitch to accept the praise of the crowd. The Uruguayan team were the ones that did that. So that also has become a tradition going all the way back to 1924. So anyway, you have those kind of influences. And I think what Argentina has also seen is just how important it was for Uruguay in terms of its own national self-esteem. There are some of the quotes that the politicians talk about and some of the journalists talk about in Uruguayan's case, saying, "You are Uruguay. You are now the motherland, boys. The symbol of that little dot, nearly invisible on the map, which has been getting larger, larger, and larger." These are the kind of narratives that are being talked about. So, when Uruguay and Argentina go back for 1928, they are both getting back with this in mind, that the importance for the nation is there. The pride for the nation is there. The chance to be better than Europe is there. They've been on these, their major club sides have been on tour around Europe in the intervening years, in 1925 with Nacional, with Boca Juniors. So these things are very much at stake. And there are more journalists attending. In the 1924 World Cup, there's just one journalist who goes to Paris with the Uruguayan team. So he has the whole power of creating the narrative. And it's a very political narrative. He is the nephew of a previous president of Uruguay and of a particular party as well. So everything he is writing is saying, this is the benefit of the Battier party. We've got to look at Antilio Narancio, who actually mortgaged his farmhouse so that the Uruguayan team could actually go as well. But he is a politician as well as being the head of the Football Federation and the head of Nacional. So the fact he's a politician means that these successes are a political triumph for the ruling party as well. So, the Uruguayans are aware of this power, the Argentinians are aware of this political power, and the journalists that are also going, because a lot of the newspapers have political affiliations, are also aware of this. And so this is what the two nations are going for. And back in Argentina and Uruguay, what we also have is, for each game, we have these loudspeakers outside the newspaper headquarters that are kind of reporting on the game, that are kind of, when the telegram message comes across, they are then shouting out through these loudhailers what's happened, and they're putting it on a kind of a blackboard type thing as well. And we have apparently these huge crowds for each of the games, the first round, the second round, semi-finals and final, desperate to try and find out what's going on. And that's happening in Montevideo, and that's happening in Buenos Aires. So what we do have is these teams going out on a mission. And again, it does feel like, with the way the tournament's organised, we have kind of Argentina marching kind of headlong through one half of the draw, and Uruguay actually having quite a struggle with, pretty much the hardest kind of 3 or 4 games you could actually have at that time to get there. But it's probably the game that certainly most of South America wanted. And, in some ways it might have been the kind of final that, a lot of people might have expected as well.
Gary, I'm going to come to you first, because Pete touched there on the different, on the routes, and we'll come to. I'm going to ask Stephen about Argentina's goal fest in their half the draw. But for you, Gary, in the 24 Olympics, we pointed out that Uruguay are in Paris and they beat France. The first round, the Olympics is in Amsterdam and they're playing the Dutch. Pete said it was the tough half of the draw, and it really was the tough half of the draw.
Yeah, the first game Uruguay beat the Dutch again, and that wasn't great. But before that, it's interesting. I mean, the other South American team that were there were Chile, because there were not the correct number of teams to get a straight knockout. They had a preliminary round, and Portugal beat Chile 4-2. Actually, Chile were 2-0 up, and the first goal scorer of the tournament was a guy called Guillermo Sabadell Tapia, and he scored the first goal in the tournament. And as to half an hour, Chile 2-0 up, and it looks like, the journey across the Atlantic hasn't been wasted. Then Portugal came back and beat them 4-2, and they got knocked out. But the Dutch obviously lost in their first game. And so what, I don't know whether it's pre-planned or off the cuff or whatever, but they arranged what they called a consolation tournament. So because Chile had lost out in the preliminary, three other teams, the first three teams who got eliminated, were put into this tournament. And so Chile played Mexico. Mexico had got beaten by Spain 7-1 in their first game. And they played Chile. Chile won 3-1. And then they got to the final, which was termed the consolation final. The Dutch played Chile. And it was a 2-2 draw. And the trophy was going to be decided on the toss of a coin. The Dutch won the toss of the flip of the coin. But they decided politically it would be much more appropriate to award the trophy to Chile. So Chile had played 3 games, they'd lost one, drew one, and won one, and went home with a trophy, which I think was a great sort of consolation tournament. There you go. The Dutch hosts ended up with bugger all, except for winning the toss of a coin. Yeah, going back to the sort of Uruguay's passage, yeah, they played the Dutch, obviously, the hosts, so that's not going to be an easy game. Then they played Germany. And then in the semi-final, it was a real crunch game when they faced Italy, and they got through 3-2. And to get to the game that Pete said, they're all South America, the Rio Platense derby facing Argentina, and it went to 2 games. But, I'll let Stevie talk about the flood, the absolute flood of goals Argentina got.
Yeah, so obviously, Stephen, as Pete mentioned about the people in the press offices updating the blackboards. Now, if you're on the Argentina blackboard updating, you are a busy guy. I think it's, let me do my math, 23 goals in 3 games. That's a lot of updating that's going on there. But I know it's very difficult to sort of, because you can't get away from current context when you look at the nations that were played. But Argentina's route, when you compare it with Uruguay's route to the final, it's very different.
It is very, very different indeed. I mean, the lad doing the score updates on the blackboards for the Argentinian games needs extra chalk. There's no doubt about it. I mean, 11 past the USA, 6 past Belgium, 6 past Egypt. This is kind of, I don't know. It's back to everything we mentioned. Blackadder goes forth last time. It's the Battle of Umbutu Gorge again, and it's all the sharp mangoes rather than kind of like the decent football teams. It's very, very different for Uruguay. What I would say in Uruguay's jaunt to the final for this one is that to the Italy game's telling. This is the one that kind of proves the potency. To go to Europe and to beat the best of what Europe has to offer in that semi-final is absolutely epic. What is clearly a close game. That game can't be undervalued whatsoever. And then to go on and do this two-gamed fight against Argentina in the final, in the gold medal match as well. So to navigate all that way through, yes, it's the host. Yes, it's Germany, although they've not annexed any Austrian players at this point in time. And then it's Italy. This is the Italy side that will win the World Cup. Italy will be world champions in 1934 and 1938. And that's one of the great questions of how would have Uruguay done on European soil in 1934 and 1938. You only have to look at 1924 and 1928 to see what they were capable of doing in Europe. And along that route, they've beaten the best that Europe have to offer in that tournament. Or the best that are willing to stand up against them.
As luck would have it, I'm going to ask that impossible question to Pete a little bit later on, I think. Now you've just popped it in my head. Pete, the final, I'll leave you to have the final say on the gold medal match. Like you say, it's when you look at the draw and you look at it sort of in black and white, and where they're situated, it's almost an inevitable march to this conclusive game. And as Gary alluded to, it even goes to a replay. Where this is one where the Olympic gold medal match goes to a replay, and they duly give it a replay.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the way in which FIFA realizes how much money is to be made from the World Cup competitions and why they should have control of it, because it is about money. The Amsterdam organisers were absolutely delighted when the first game ends 1-1, because then they get to host another game with the full stadium. I can't remember how many people could get in the ground where it's hosted. Certainly at least 40,000 people. I think it's something like, I can't remember, 280,000 people that are the kind of total audience for the tournament, maybe something like that. But this is a money spinner for the Amsterdam Olympics, and FIFA are taking note of this. I think something that's interesting as well is that on what the march of these two South American teams has meant for this kind of clash of styles between Europe and South America. We've talked a lot about this being encounters, and I think it's worth establishing what kind of narratives there are going on about these encounters. So El Dia, after the Germany game, described the game as being the value of intelligence was opposed to violence and obfuscation. Two schools of football clashed yesterday in Amsterdam, that of intelligence and that of strength, with the former emerging victorious. Germany, the last hope of European representation against the South Americans, made use of all their means at their disposal, but were impotent against the courage of our lads. So that comes from a book by Andres Morales, which kind of won a prize about the history of early Uruguayan football in the press. So that kind of shows you what's there. And again, it's worth noting that it wasn't just the Germans being violent in that game. One of their centre-backs, Cal, got banned for a year for a particularly violent challenge after the game. The Uruguayans were much more intelligent than that. Nasazi had also been involved in what's called a lamentable incident in the press, but the Uruguayans only banned him for one game, so he could play the final. Very, very intelligent Uruguayans. Got to head it to them. But I think that this game in 1928, the Olympic Games final, is one of those great memories of Uruguay. It's one of the great kind of early memories of South American football. And the goal that finally wins it by Scaroni, it's even got kind of, people know what happens. Borjas kind of nods it off to Scaroni and says, "Yours, Hector," "Por el tuyo, Hector," in Spanish. And Scaroni kind of, smashes it into the back of the net. And again, Eduardo Galeano, if you haven't read, his book, Football en Sol y Sombra, then please read it. But what he says about this goal is that Borjas met the ball with his back to goal and headed it to Scaroni, screaming, "Yours, Hector." And Scaroni kicked it sharply on the fly. The Argentine goalkeeper, Bosillo, dived for it, but it already hit the net. The ball bounced defiantly back onto the field. Uruguayan striker Figueroa sent it in again, punishing the ball with a swift kick, because leaving the goal like that was bad form. Which I just think is magnificent writing. This is why Galeano's book is one of the great kind of football books of all time. But this is a momentous occasion, and it also leads to one of the first scapegoats of Argentine football. And we all know that Argentina enjoy finding someone to blame. It's not normally themselves, it's a referee, or it's someone else, or it's drug tests, or it's FIFA, or it's England somehow. But in this World Cup, it's one of their own players, a lad called Gain Sarain. And apparently he has a chance in the very last minute of the first leg with the score at 1-1 to score what would be the winning goal. He doesn't make it. The goalkeeper Masali of Uruguay makes the save. And apparently as the game ends, he was crying at the end of the match. The goalkeeper later said he shot it in the only place he could do, so I saved it. But there's a kind of a myth or a legend that apparently the Argentine players had to stop him committing suicide in the hotel afterwards. So upset was he. And unfortunately, the lad never played for Argentina ever again. So, so even that had, huge impact. What you can look at as being the reasons why Uruguay probably win the second game is that they're more sensible about the squad. They make several changes. They dropped Petrone, who Gary talked about earlier. They dropped Ordinaran, Fernandez, Campolo, and Castro, and they bring in Arremon, Borjas, Piri, Scaroni, and Figueroa. So there is a certain more freshness. A lot of the Uruguay forward line is fresher than their Argentinian compatriots. And that's probably the difference. Argentina see it as being a very, very tough game that could have gone either way. The Uruguayan goalkeeper had a great game. Uruguay say much the same thing, and the press reports about it. And even Jules Rimet, talks about this kind of being, a wonderful spectacle of football that Europe kind of sat back and watched. It's a game for the ages. It's one of the great early internationals of South American football history, without any doubt.
Gary, anything that you would like to add to Pete's eloquent description of the final?
Yeah, a few things I picked up when I was doing some research yesterday. It's interesting that we mentioned about Talasconi. He actually scored 11 goals, and that's only one less than Uruguay scored, their entire team, throughout the tournament. The famous tango singer Carlos Gardel wrote a tango about him in 1928. This is the same guy, actually, who he performed for the Argentinian team in the hotel on the day before the final in 1930, or on the day of the final, I can't remember, but very famous Argentinian tango singer. And the lyrics go is, Talasconi to score a goal from the middle of the field. I mean, that's the English version rather than that. But just a couple of other things, Pete mentioned about the rivalry between Argentina and Uruguay. But between 1924 and 1928, Argentina only lost to Uruguay. Between 1924 and 1928, Uruguay only lost to Argentina. They didn't lose any other games. So that's how sort of good the rivalry was, how fierce the rivalry was. And Pete mentioned about the interest in the game. Apparently, the Dutch FA received 250,000 requests for tickets for the final. I mean, that's interesting. And I don't know about the final as well. I mean, when we mentioned about Petroni, I said it was important when we talked about 1924. He scored in the first game, and he didn't play in the second. But the two guys that the Uruguayan coach brought in, Figueroa and Scaroni, both scored in the second leg. So that's pretty good team selection by the Uruguayan. And interestingly, the final point to make out, Pete mentioned in the 24 tournament, when the Dutch had lost out to Uruguay in the semi-final, I think it was, and the disputed penalty, they wouldn't have a Dutch referee in the final. A Dutch referee refereed both the finals this tournament.
I'm gonna use up a couple of potential anecdotes straight after Gary's one, since he's mentioned Gardel. So Gardel is generally seen as being Argentinian, but there is actually a kind of battle of ownership over him between Uruguay and Argentina. So there is a kind of a story that Gardel was actually born in Uruguay, and therefore the greatest tango singer of all time should be Uruguayan rather than Argentina.
Wow.
And one of the ways in which the Uruguayans say that Gardel is actually Uruguayan in heart and is because he sang to the Argentinians the tango on the 1928 before the final, and Argentina lost. And in 1930, he did the same thing. He went to the Argentinian hotel and sang again. And in 1930, spoilers, Argentina lost as well. So this, for Uruguayans, is definitive proof that Gardel was the kind of the curse of the Argentina football team, and his heart always remained in Uruguay. The other little thing about the tickets for the World Cup from the Dutch is that for the very first game, again, it's total bad luck that it's a kind of a draw, that it's awful for the kind of hosts of the Olympic Games that the home side have to face Uruguay. But apparently the Amsterdam City Council all voted unanimously to go and get tickets for the game, to get time off so they could all go and watch it. So, that's the kind of level of popularity within Holland as well. The City Council are saying, yeah, let's go.
Oh, guys. There's so much to unpick there. Not only Pete's Dutch accent, but also Gary. I was so hoping you were actually going to sing, and we could do Aidan Williams style and tag you on the end of this podcast, singing
tango, mate.
Singing out the Argentine tango to the Argentine national team. But yeah, I would really like for that. I would still like for that to happen, Gary. If any time between now and the end of this podcast you would like to do that would be great. Stephen, any final thought? I don't know how to conclude the 28 Olympics, but any final thoughts from you before we move on to the first World Cup?
I'd just say that by 28, they've won the gold, 2 successive times. It's clearly going to be not just a battle of the body, but a battle of the mind for Argentina, not just Argentina, but especially Argentina, but also everyone else to stop Uruguay winning on home soil in 1930 is a pretty tall order.
Agreed. So, Pete, we're now handing back over to you while Gary just sips some warm lemon and honey while he gets his voice ready for this Argentine tango that's going to burst forth at any point in the middle of this podcast. So, we're coming to it is only 2 years later. This is not now a 4-year cycle. This is only 2 years on from the Paris Olympics, that the first World Cup. And, how do you go about debating where to host this very first, what is to hopefully become an iconic competition? But, how do you go about deciding where the first one is going to be? And clearly Uruguay put down markers with their performances in the previous 2 unofficial World Championships.
Yeah, this is a kind of a story that's been simplified and is actually much more complex. It's that the kind of the easy narrative that gets kind of propagated here and there is that because they'd won 1924 and 1928, they offered to host it in 1930. It's the year of their centenary, and kind of FIFA votes unanimously to allow this to happen. The truth of this is far more complex. This is not a fait accompli. This is not something that the European nations are overly happy with. Both those within FIFA and those without as well. We have to bear in mind that the British nations are not part of FIFA, and equally we're not happy probably with not only a source of power being removed from its auspices, but also shock horror going to Latin America as well. So I think what you've got to bear in mind is that the FIFA is very Eurocentric. It's very centralized within Europe at this time. Every single one of the FIFA conferences have been held in Europe. The major nations of Europe hold the positions of power. But 1928 creates a little bit of a change because, as it's the Olympic Games that year, there are more South American delegates that turn up to the 1928 conference. And one of the things they managed to do is kind of vote as a bloc to ensure that Enrique Buero, who we mentioned before as being very instrumental about Uruguay even being able to participate in the 1924 Olympic Games, Enrique Buero is nominated to be the vice president of FIFA. So Uruguay have a delegate in a particularly important position. But this doesn't really mean much when in 1929, which is the conference in Barcelona for FIFA, where the decision is going to be made about who is going to host this first World Cup, it would be very unlikely that South American delegates are going to be present. And again, there are a few more South American members of FIFA now. Other nations have joined since the 1922, 1923, when it's only Argentina, Uruguay, and I think possibly Chile as well. So it's unlikely that they are going to have much of a voting bloc. And Uruguay, because of Buero, are very aware of this problem and the fact that there are various other European nations that are very keen to host it. We have Sweden, we have Italy, we have Hungary. I think we have France as well. I think there are 5 nations that are looking to host it. So they have to kind of do some very careful politics in order to try and get this victory. So what they do is that they've had the idea, and they're aware that it's going to have to be a very strong bid, both from Uruguay itself, but also needs support. So a lot of diplomacy goes on. They approach all of the other South American Football Federation members, and they are very quickly gain support this. They all see the benefit of hosting a World Cup in South America. They think it'll be a demonstration of how the game in the Americas is moving forward, how it's part of the world system. They see that Uruguay hosting it will also reflect well on them. And they also crucially see it as much cheaper to be able to play in South America than it would be to get to Europe. Again, bear in mind, in 1929, we have things like the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash. So this is not going to be easy. So we have a voting bloc of South American nations, and crucially, the Uruguayan Federation persuades them to travel to Europe for the 1920 conference so they can vote in support of Uruguay. And also what's important is that Uruguay, realizing that they're going to have to persuade the European nations to vote for them, have to say, right, how can we attract them? So they make it effectively state policy. And this is again where football and politics are very close together. We have a lot of football federation representatives who are also politicians in the ruling party. So what they do is make a law where, you know, there is a certain amount of money that the state is going to provide for the games to guarantee the participation of, or the travel and costs and stay of, 20 team delegations from the European teams that are present. And this is quite some undertaking from a country like Uruguay, particularly when you think of potentially what they would hope would be involved. As we know, only 4 European teams travel, but they would be hoping that Spain would go, that Italy would go, that Austria would go, that Hungary would go. Probably they're realistic and didn't think Britain would go, or the British teams would go, but the hope's there. So if all of those teams had gone and Uruguay had guaranteed all that money to stay, that is a huge financial undertaking. But essentially, when the conference happens in 29, Uruguay have not only the support of the whole of Latin America, but also guarantees of being able to run it financially with state support, which is something that the other teams can't do. So when they kind of vote down the alternative games funding policy that is put forward, again, this is a kind of a block vote by the South American Federation delegates to say, no, we're not going to accept that funding proposal. That would have been based there because it would have kind of guaranteed a certain gate receipts or funding receipts for all the various European teams based on the ones present, assuming that was going to be in Europe as well. Once that's shot down, then 2 nations pull out straight away. And when the Uruguay delegate puts it around that they'll be paying, the other nations realise they can't host it either. They can't put together a suitable economic package that will satisfy everyone. So suddenly, from a position where we have 5 European nations who everyone thinks are vying for the hosting, Uruguay and the South American the South American delegates kind of work against them, and almost kind of the third option that runs alongside where every other European nation is competing against itself. But what doesn't happen is that effectively not every nation is therefore delighted to then vote for Uruguay. They've effectively been outmaneuvered, outpoliticked. So this is probably one of the reasons why Italy, why Austria, why Switzerland, why Germany, and all the other European nations don't go, even though there is no opposition to Uruguay being the host of the 1930 World Cup as it ends up. It's not a decision they've all agreed with unanimously and happily and delightedly. It's something they got outmaneuvered for. So that's kind of, I guess, the political explanation of it. There is a kind of a great article about all of this by a guy called Lorenzo Jalabert D'Amato, who explains it in a lot more detail and a lot more kind of accurately than I've probably managed there. But there's a huge amount of football politics. There's a huge amount of football diplomacy, and there's a huge amount of kind of the European South American encounters, and also this rivalry in kind of hosting and the kind of power relations that are all very much present at this particular time.
Absolutely brilliant again. And Gary, I suppose, it wouldn't be football, it wouldn't be a World Cup if politics wasn't at the heart of it. And here we go, the birth of a major competition, and straight away we're kicking off with politics at the very heart of the first decision.
Yeah, I mean, Pete mentioned the Uruguayan diplomat, and one of the articles that Pete sent across was to read. I mean, that's fascinating that this guy was a proper mover and shaker to sort things out for Uruguay. And it's interesting. It's the first World Cup. Obviously, the Olympics were amateur in inverted commas, but this was open to professionals. And I mean, if there was any chance of England going, the FA would jumped on that as an excuse. Anyway, this is one of the reasons that the Danes, who actually backed England in 1924 by not going, and the Germans apparently refused to go because of the potential for it being professional. It's a really interesting thing. I've got a note here about 2 French guys who actually were deemed to be professional, but French club football was very much amateur. But these 2 guys were professionals. Their name were Edward Delfour and Marcel Langier. They couldn't play club football for their clubs because they were deemed professional, but were selected for the French national squad, even though they hadn't been playing. That's sort of fascinating, weird thing about the professional and amateur sort of, diametrically opposed pulling. And then, I mean, as you say, politics and football, never was it so.
Yeah, really. Stephen, I'll let you sort of go through the teams that are there. And, I suppose this discussion around professionalism and, what it meant in terms of teams that could enter. But, straight away, this first competition, probably arguably maybe the United States, but certainly in the latter World Cups, as the expansion has come along, the United States have been quite regular. Obviously, our first World Cups, there was never a chance of the US qualifying, but you look at you look at who actually goes, the 13 teams that go, and there is football pedigree through all those teams. But before you discuss them, normally we have a YouTube klaxon, but I'm going to go with the Wikipedia klaxon here, because if you go onto the Wikipedia page and it tells you who was there from the different continents, and then it has Asia with Japan and what was Cyan withdrew. And then when it comes to Africa, it just has Egypt, brackets, missed ship. And that is it. That's all it says. This whole page about a World Cup tournament, and right in the middle of it is literally brackets, missed ship. So whoever's written this Wikipedia page, brilliant. No explanation. They didn't even put "miss the boat," and I can't believe they didn't put "miss the boat."
That is.
They did literally miss the boat, but yeah,
they literally missed the boat.
Yeah,
they really did.
Missed ship in brackets.
Yeah, missed ship.
But yeah, the teams that are there, other than the ones who missed the boat.
Yeah, America, USA aside, who to be fair to them, will become a regular at the World Cup from 1990 onwards, reach a quarter final in 2002. These are kind of like many of the nations that we grew up expecting to be at World Cups. Mexico, host in 1970 and 1986. Argentina would be 3 times winners eventually. Bolivia stand out as one that, 1994 aside, what else have they done apart from kill off Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? You've got Brazil, you've got Paraguay, Peru. There's a sash. That's all you need to know. I don't even want to know if they had a sash on the shirt of that tournament. If they didn't, I don't want to see a picture of it. And then Belgium, France, Romania, Yugoslavia, have all braved it out. I think what the great thing about the European nations, it's that variability about them travelling as well. They've all had to have their arm up the back. France have travelled because Jules Remy has essentially harangued them into it. Romania are there by royal decree because they have a king who's into his foot. There is kind of like this great kind of that it's the dawning of something new, but nobody fully realises what they've got on their hands. You've got the French coach, the French national coach, doesn't even bother going. He's kind of like, no, I'm not doing this, and he just doesn't go. And the star striker, again, he's another one that opts out. And then you've got kind of like Belgium, Raymond Brain, fantastic name. He's essentially suspended because he's opened a cafe. It's just the bizarrest of events. But yes, there is still a set of nations there. There's Brazil, who would be the most successful team in the nation. In the whole tournament, and they've never missed one. And the fact that they had to be there to be able to put that in motion is it's reassuring that they're there. But yeah, here are a set of nations that have been bold enough to say we'll be there. For whatever reason, they've just gone for it. But yeah, Bolivia stand out there as kind of like killing off Butch and Sundance, and was that partial bicycle kick of a goal? Was it Echeverri or whoever it was in the World Cup? But yeah, Bolivia, I'd be glad to see you back in a World Cup. Just because you were there in 1930.
Excellent. Nicely summarised on the competing nations of the 1930 World Cup. Pete, obviously, I am, by the way, looking forward to your anecdote competition at the end of this episode, because you've got 6 years to cover, and you've already gone with loads. So I can't wait to hear which anecdote. Well, that's going to be particularly good news for you, Pete, without spoiling who won last week. But that's good that you've got a good one this week. Yeah, I don't want to spoil the surprise. Pete, getting into the competition, the format's pretty straightforward. It's a nice division of nations and continents as much as is possible, with only 13 teams and only 4 going from Europe, 7 from South America. But it's still a very nicely and even spread of, if not horrific prime number to have thrown into your first tournament. We call them session busters when you do teaching PE, and you end up with a prime number in your group. But it's a session buster of a World Cup because essentially Egypt missed the boat.
I mean, we have 4 groups. We have Group 1 is Argentina, Chile, France, Mexico. We've got Group 2, Brazil, Bolivia, and Yugoslavia. Group 3, Uruguay, Peru, Romania. And then Group 4, Belgium, Paraguay, and USA. No real talk about the group of death at that point. Arguably, I think it's probably Group 1 if we want to discuss that. I reckon that's probably that. And that's not just because Luis Monti is in that particular group doing his best effort to kind of break as many legs and be as much of a thug as he can be in each of the games. It's kind of worth looking at Luis Monti's trail of carnage. Pretty much every game that Argentina play involves some kind of fight or lots of penalties or complaints from opposition. Certainly that happens in Chile. There is a mass brawl in that particular game. Even the game against France, the very first kind of big encounter between Europe and Latin America in that particular one, they somehow, there's in one particular report that Monti had been bullying players all game. Laurent, one of the players, had been injured. The French goalkeeper had also got injured. And Argentina win 1-0. But again, this is where we start getting these European versus South America kind of favoritism and dodgy decisions and so on. And the fact that one of the French forwards, I think it's one of the professionals that Gary actually mentioned, breaks away with about 6 minutes to go and is through on goal. And the Brazilian referee blows up for full time with 6 minutes left. Now, as British, I think we should all find this particularly funny that French were denied in this early occasion. But this kind of was the first major kind of diplomatic, or not diplomatic at this point, but major confrontation point. The French players are kind of surrounding the referee. Eventually, the game gets started again, but obviously that breakaway never happened. And this is a series. There is a series of all these kind of bad decisions. Uruguay in the semi-final. Apparently, there's an equalising goal from Yugoslavia that's chalked off that would have made it 2-2. And then shortly afterwards, Uruguay score a goal where apparently the ball had gone out. And then a Uruguayan policeman on the sideline apparently kicks it back in with the referee not noticing it. I mean, these are the things that actually become legends because there's been a Yugoslavian film, made recently about these early pioneers from Uruguay telling these stories. And they present Uruguay as villains, as this kind of cheating group of South Americans who somehow conned Yugoslavia out of a merited first World Cup victory in this semi-final. We can ignore the fact that they eventually won 6-1. But there are incidences of violence, there are incidences of dispute. All of them seem to involve South America and Europe in one way or another. There are players who are left with broken legs. Certainly in the Peru versus Romania game, one of the Peruvian, we actually see the first sending off in that game of Placido Galindo. But prior to that, a Romanian player has had his leg broken by a particularly meaty challenge, and another one has been left on the sidelines from another one. And he's the guy that actually scores the winning goal in that game because he's kind of comes back onto the pitch heroically despite his knee being dislocated or something. It's kind of hanging around on the sideline. The Peruvian players kind of completely ignore him. A cross comes in and he's kind of hobbled towards the goal mouth and ends up scoring, the goal that I think either makes it 2-1 or 3-1, that eventually leads to Romania winning their first game in World Cup history. So we see a lot of these kind of Europe versus Latin America encounters. But essentially, as kind of the tournament host would hope, and again, how the footballers of the Rio Platense hope, and certainly for the benefit of the ticket sales, Argentina and Uruguay once again kind of march their way towards the final and will eventually meet in the Estadio Centenario.
It's a great setup by Pete Gary, who's sort of laid the foundations there of the competitions. He's kicked us off with politics before the tournament even started, and now he's thrown in the skullduggery and the genuine dastardly on-field play that Cyril Sneakley would be incredibly proud of.
Yeah, well, Dick Dastardly in these times was definitely Lewis Monty, and he scored the goal in the replayed Olympic final in '28. He scored the one goal for Argentina in the replayed final, and it'll feature highly in our next episode as well. But yeah, Monty was a bit of a character, shall we say, a character. There's a few, obviously, in first World Cup, there's a few interesting firsts that's happened, and Pete mentioned about Galindo being the first player sent off. First World Cup goal was scored by Lucien Laurent, France. The winning goal, this is more about one than first, but the winning goal of the final was scored by Hector Castro, who only had one arm. He'd lost an arm in a woodworking accident early in his life. And it was the only tournament where there was the third place playoff. And it also had the lowest attendance of any World Cup game, which was when Romania played Peru. Just 300 people registered watching the game. And it was also, there was no official ball for the tournaments, and each team wanted to play with their own ball. In the final, Uruguay against Argentina, I think Argentina played with their ball in the first half, and Uruguay played with theirs in the second. Really weird. And the first own goal in the World Cup was scored by Manuel Rosas, a Mexican, who incidentally, Mexico, who had lost to Chile after losing 7-1 to Spain in 1928, played 3 games in this tournament and lost a lot.
Stephen, it's a first competition, and it's not like it's a first go at this, because clearly, FIFA have organised, as we've said, Olympic game, the football competition at the Olympic Games, which, as we've said, is a de facto World Cup. But I suppose, and Pete sort of alluded to it towards the end of what he was saying, they couldn't have wished for a better final than the one they got in terms from a footballing perspective, and the tournament being a success.
Oh, absolutely. You've got this tournament taking place in Montevideo, because it doesn't go any further than Montevideo, and then you've got kind of like Argentina, coming across the River Plate to take them on. Argentina's kind of like path to that final is just so unremittingly brutal in what they mete out, as Pete said earlier on. It's just magnificently artistic. When France have that chance to break through and score, and the referee kind of like blows full time 6 minutes early. France only have 9 players on the pitch. The goalkeeper, as Peter said, taken up. What I like about the fact that the French goalkeeper, Alex Thibault, I think we would have to call him THEPOT. I look at that name and all I see is Alex Teapot. and that's good enough for me. Alex Teapot took ill in that game against Argentina. But yeah, broken legs, all of it. 5 penalties in the Argentina-Mexico game. The night before the Argentina-France game, the Argentinian players were kept awake all night by the large French contingent in Montevideo of expats who were celebrating Bastille Day. Argentina got a bit of their own back along the way, with this. It had to be this final. That tournament just had to have that. And the fact that there hasn't been an all South American final, World Cup final ever since, it should have happened at some point. And up until Argentina winning the most recent World Cup, it was hard to see a South American team reaching a World Cup final, one of them, let alone 2. We'd have to hope that Argentina's victory, in Qatar opens the door for more South American success. Because it gets a bit boring when it's just kind of like constant European, winners. But yeah, this is just like, it's perfection really, and the fact that it's the rematch of the Olympic final was so close, and the 2 teams have just kind of like, both had the kind of like their aggravations in getting there. They've both kicked and punched the way there to a degree, but they've played their football in doing so, and it's just the perfect final in that respect. Although I would have taken Alex Teapot being involved in this as well. That just would have been.
You can't pick him as your goalkeeper, just so you're aware, because it's an Argentina special. So don't be thinking you can select Alex Teapot.
I will declare him the greatest French goalkeeper of all time.
He did save a penalty against Chile. I think he's the first goalkeeper to save a penalty in the World Cup. So
See?
So
there we go. But was he a little teapot though? That's the thing.
Short and stout. I'll tell you what though. He would have been good in the Lipton's Cup competition.
Oh!
Thank you, guys. He would have been outstanding in that. Just a little call back there to previous discussions.
They kept him in the cup anyway.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, this final though, without him, it was still a storm in a teacup as well.
Hey.
Pete, any tea jokes? No. Any with regards to obviously in the final, Argentina at halftime, are winning the game, and it's like we said that it was only 2 years ago since Uruguay win the sort of the World Championships, for want of a better word, after a replay, and here they are 45 minutes away from sort of avenging that defeat, and yet it goes the same. It goes the same way, and as we know, and it's not part of this episode, but the World Cup moves en masse to Europe. Then it's the Second World War, and it's 1950, and in this generation of players where everything has been so close and so intense, and they must know each other inside out. And then all of a sudden, it's almost like this was the last, on a global scale, this was their last chance. Not that we were to know this, but this was their last chance, and for this generation, it disappears.
Yeah, and I think it was anyway. There is a certain, certainly Jose Andrade, the great hero of 1924. It's kind of very much still in the team only by past glories. He's seen as having a bad tournament, although in some of the footage that remains of the final, you do see him making a really brilliant block. He kind of in terms of 1930 footage, he comes flying off the screen to kind of block a shot by one of the Argentinian forwards. But he's kind of, on the way. And certainly, some of the other players are. Petrone has had a bad knee injury that he hasn't really recovered from. Scaroni's possibly heading towards the end. Pedro Seyer again is probably heading towards the end. So it is a kind of, there is a bit of that sense of the swan song, or potentially the swan song. So I think there's no way that some of those players are going to any World Cup that might happen in 1934. It's not known where it'll be yet. But, quite a few of them, as well, as we'll talk about in the next episode, have got other offers that they might take up. I think what's worth, in terms of how the players knew each other, we can put this out as a quick question, is how many times do you think Argentina and Uruguay have played before this final, internationally? Don't know if any of you guys know. Do you want to have a guess?
I will have a guess, because I don't get asked questions very often in this. I'm going to go with 22.
Against each other. Uruguay versus Argentina international games before this final.
Okay, let's think.
I'm going to go with 90.
It's 103.
Wow. Well done, Stephen. That question of sport box of yours has really kicked in.
Pulls one out of the bag, despite the guy not paying attention at the back has
Sir, he's got a book in his desk, sir. He's looking up the answers, sir.
This is that bit where the teacher picks on kind of like the one who thinks he's not been paying attention and is just absolutely gutted that he's come out with the answer.
Steve very lucky.
And you were answering another question anyway. That wasn't even the question you were answering.
How many goals did Scragg score?
Yeah. So, if I don't like the question, I'll just make I just answer a question that I wanted to answer.
But it is, it's remarkable, isn't it? 103 games in that derby had already been played before this final. So, these teams know each other. And again, what that also means is that this has become an embedded rivalry. They may be brothers, there may be the discussion of being brothers, but we've seen in 1924 in the real World Cup final, if Argentina had been there, a huge amount of rivalry is being created. 1928 has created this national rivalry. So, and brothers don't get on when it really matters. Brothers are capable of having a real scrap. And there are lots of stories about this final. The referee Jean Langenu of Belgium, has demanded security. He only gets permission from the Belgian FA, at 12 o'clock before the game to referee it. We have the fact that all of the Argentinians who are crossing the River Plate, a lot held up. There's a kind of fog bank which prevents a lot of Argentinians from actually getting to the game. But there is a huge amount of effort from the Uruguayan army and police to ensure that Argentine revolvers are not getting across the River Plate and are not getting into the stadium as well. So this is a big deal, and there is a lot of tension. One of the Uruguayan forwards, Juan Pellegrino Anselmo, actually backs out of the game because he says, I know it's going to be a fight, and that's not for me. He's known as being a bit of a dandy, a very good player, but a bit of a dandy, so he doesn't play. So Gary's already said the guy that scores the fourth goal, Hector Castro, the one-armed El Manco, is only playing because Anselmo has effectively bottled it. And the other player to bottle it really is Luis Monti, the thug of the previous game, in the fact that he has received death threats, apparently anonymous death threats from a lot of the probably Uruguayans to say, you better not do what you normally do. So he has what is described as being the most gentlemanly performance of his career. And that he's apparently, helping people to get up after they've fallen over in the game. These are the kind of legends that said about it. One of his teammates, the guy that is the longest surviving member of the final, Varallo, actually says that Luis Monti, didn't have the huevos, didn't have the balls in that particular match to win it. He says, they wanted it more than us. So there are lots of great stories about the pressure, the rivalry, the fans, the atmosphere. And again, I think that what's lovely about it is that there is footage of the game that you can see. You can see, I think, 5 or 6 of the 8 of the 6. No, it's not all of them. I think it's 4 or 5 of the goals of the final. And one of them, the third Uruguayan goal by Santos Iriarte, is an absolute cracker. It's not perfectly seeable, but it's, a shot from, 25, 30 metres out from the left wing that goes into the top corner. It's a great goal. And, and Castro's goal, again, is a decent goal, a nice header that loops over the Argentinian goalkeeper. So there is footage that remains of this occasion. Andrade's block, even though he had a terrible game, that's, a key moment that possibly has been lost. And somehow there is footage that still remains. And it's probably worth saying here as well, I kind of like mentioning the people that, I've kind of researched from, because a lot of people have done a lot of hard work on writing articles and creating websites. And a shout out goes here to, I think it's Dean Lockyer, who's got the Twitter account and blog of the 1930 World Cup project, who's probably sought out more newspaper reports, more photos, more videos, more anecdotes than certainly anyone else has, I imagine. People have written books about it. But if you want to know more about this World Cup and everything that goes on, then do look at his blog and do look at the Twitter account, because there are so many incredible stories and incredible photos and, old newspaper reports that he's gone out and sought with a kind of a good community of historians across Europe and South America and the US who love doing things like we're doing now.
Absolutely brilliant. Gary, anything you would like to add to Pete's comments, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a few of those I was going to mention, but a couple of things about the Argentine reaction. What happened after the final, after the defeat? I found there's an article in El Gráfico that's, Pete mentioned earlier that it's an Argentinian characteristic that they always blame somebody else, and it said the El Gráfico noted that the referee let the Uruguayans go unpunished with violent challenges, while the Argentinians were doing what they previously had agreed to play fair and not to make violent fouls. In defeat, the Argentinian players and journalists took solace in seeing themselves as more civilised than their violent neighbours. In a juxtaposition to that, apparently, as revenge, the Uruguayan embassy in Buenos Aires was vandalised by citizens, and the government cut off diplomatic relations with Uruguay. A very sporting, I think, reasonable sort of reaction. But interestingly, I mean, one of the things that this sort of segue into what we sort of discuss in the next episode, several of the Argentinian players signed professional contracts in Italy afterwards, and El Gráfico lamented after the World Cup final defeat, and this happening is a sad and devastating memory in our hearts.
Gary, that's a great link, a great segue into the next. I mean, granted, Stephen and I don't know what the next episode's about, so I'm just going to have to trust that it is, because I can see Stephen just looking as blank as I am about what the next one's about.
That was almost as esoteric as Gary's kind of like geographical ones in the cities. In the cities.
Yeah, I can see Stephen just looking like, I have no idea if that's a good link or not. And to be fair, I don't know either.
It's all right. I've already peaked with winning the competition on how many times Uruguay and Argentina had already played one another.
Yeah, you can properly switch off now. Anything to add, Stephen, on the 1930? Anything you would like to add to the 1930 World Cup?
I'd just I'd fully agree with Pete on the fact that look up the footage. You do get to see a surprising amount of it for how far away it was. And I think for at least one of the goals, a wonderful early contender for a goalkeeper's dive being one for the cameras. There is one where it feels like the ball's gone past him, kind of like 3 weeks ago when he takes his dive across goal. It's just a proper kind of like work of art.
Yeah, for me, I would just like to say how magnificent the Estadio Centenario looks in that footage that you can see.
I mean, the fact that the Centenario isn't fully. It isn't
finished.
Fully completed. Yeah, and it has crossed my mind. Has it even been finished now?
Yeah.
Was it? Is it complete as it stands?
I feel like it's one of those where they thought, "Oh, look, this is as done as it's going to get. Just play it. It will come back to it at some point," and never actually really get around to coming back to it. And considering they only had 3 stadiums to play in, to have 33% of the stadiums not ready on time and still manage to get through a World Cup tournament is quite impressive. Guys, like I say, it's great. Pete, as always, brilliant. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about the anecdote section, by the way. But I feel like Pete, you've definitely covered a lot of ground tonight in terms of those 3 competitions and a 6-year span of international football. It's, like I said, to me, grossly under. I was going to say undermentioned, but I don't even think that's a word. But it's very. It just doesn't seem to have the place in the history of the game, or certainly the importance of place in the history of the game that I think it realistically this 6-year period, and certainly this Uruguayan side, and then on top of that, these 2 clashes with Argentina, it's just not enough in terms of the history and place of the game.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's really important, I mean, I think in lots of ways, part of the problem is that the people who've written most about it are Uruguayans themselves, and they've written about it in Spanish, and their books haven't come across the seas and been translated enough, because I mean, Aldo Mazzucchelli has written this one book that's fantastic. It's got tons of resources, a really in-depth look at the press, but not only just the Uruguayan press, but also the reports of the other journalists who were there as well. Andres Morales, a friend of mine I did a conference with last year, again has written another book, which won the prize about the narratives, and they really do, just explain just how big a deal it was and what kind of issues are going on and how political it was, And I think one of the things that gets lost is the press. I think that, the narratives that tends to come out is just how big a deal this was for Uruguay, how much of a national impact it was, how much it created national identity. And that's certainly true. But what is kind of erased, and what certainly Aldo and Andres Morales in their books do, is say that there is dissension. When they I think it's the day in which Uruguay are playing their first match against Peru in the Centenario. There is a communist newspaper called Justicia, Justice, which have a picture of a slum in a shanty town in Cerro and say, "This is the Centenario." That's their picture. So there is a huge amount of criticism of that the government is spending a huge amount of money. These are state funds. This is people's tax, and there is a start of the impact of the depression is starting to hit. That they have spent all this money on a stadium when people are struggling in poverty in inner city Montevideo. And again, there is a lot of criticism about the stadium as well. We talked earlier about who's in charge. There are politicians that are in charge, and the same politicians are largely in charge of football as well. So the ruling party are getting criticised for the fact that the stadium isn't complete, that people don't know how to get in because they've never been used to get into a game like this. They don't know where to sit. The security is poor, that people are getting in without tickets, that the policing is inadequate, that people could have been crushed because too many people were trying to get in. There is a huge amount of criticism of all these things going on. There's criticism of the government of the fact that they're paying for all of these foreign teams to come and take place in this tournament. So this is not a complete narrative of, aren't we good? Isn't Uruguay amazing? This is the greatest day of the tournament, the world has ever put on, and Uruguay is doing it. There is dissension. Now, this slightly shifts, when they win, or certainly when Argentina start to criticize, the way that Uruguayans behave. then we certainly see the Uruguayan press all swinging behind Uruguayan criticism the Argentinians. But for example, Justicia, we talked about the stadium. Justicia, the communist newspaper, has been criticizing the Uruguayan government for effectively having workers working in slave-like conditions, throughout the day and night. They are on 3 different shifts of 8 hours each over the 24 hours to make sure it's completed, and it isn't quite completed. The Justicia called for a general strike on the day after the World Cup win to kind of protest against the fact that the elites have triumphed, are trying to claim this triumph as Uruguay, but it's through the blood and sweat and toil of the workers. So these are lovely narratives about what's going on at the same time as, the politicians are quoting what a great success it is for Uruguay, how it's putting on the map, how, Uruguay's glory has been established. That's definitely there, but it's not the only narrative that is there. Those kind of books by Andrés, by Anlo, and by, various other Uruguayan academics, are really worth knowing about. And some of the stories that come out are really important. The fact, and there's so many other things there, like the Brazil team is largely a team of whites. There are no Sao Paulo players playing at all, for example, So there's all these stories about what's going on and who's being represented. And again, something we haven't really said is that this is a chance for South America to put on a show to kind of say, we are actually the continent that is in ascendancy, that is rising up, In Europe, we've had the First World War, we have decline, we have murderous kind of behavior, we have the atrocities of war, we have a continent in decline. Uruguay and South America are the continent of the future. This is a kind of a narrative that is being proposed by some of the elites who are trying to provide this bright future of what the Latin American race, this kind of new race, this kind of, mestizo, mixed race is capable of achieving in the future. And a lot of Latin American academics are proposing these narratives. Ariel Rodó is a great, Uruguayan theoretician who is talking about, the race of the future. And Vasconcelos in Mexico is doing the same. There's various others doing similar things. So the football and the World Cup almost becomes a concentration point of what Latin America can be. And Uruguay is kind of at the forefront of it. It's just that there are political dissenting voices, kind of hiding in the shadows that we now don't really talk about.
It's great. It blows my mind. And I'm absolutely ashamed to say that all I can still think about are the Jetsons. And I am aware that that's probably not the right thing to say, but
that's what you took from that.
But that's what I took from it, is that the Jetsons essentially are based on Uruguayan population post 1930 World Cup, is where Hanna-Barbera got his inspiration from the Jetsons from. Yeah, that's what I think there. And the other thing is watching Gary tear his hair out when Pete mentions everything that clearly Gary has been researching over the last week.
All right.
All the anecdotes have gone. And
that Steve has just sat there with one in his back pocket that no one will even remotely have heard of because he just needs to look good for 30 seconds in class.
It's the Maverick in me too.
I know you only too well. Okay, so we need to come to the anecdote, of which I am very excited for this one because there's got to be some great ones. I can confirm that Gary's early finish of a 6-0 win, so they didn't miss the boat, is the anecdote winner of last week, which puts the score at 1-1-0. So obviously you mentioned, Pete, that you've got a really good anecdote, which is great because otherwise you're going to be going further behind in the anecdote stakes.
I'm going for weight of anecdotes of numbers rather than pure quality of one.
You're just going to fire a load out and hope that one sticks. Excellent. So as the current winner, Gary, if you've got any left, and Pete hasn't said them all, which clearly is now also Pete's new tactic, where he just comes up with as many as he can and hope he's got everyone's. You get to go first on this week's anecdote competition.
Okay. Well, I was going to mention the Brazilian one that Pete just said about the rivalry, because it's pretty much about like the Argentinian one and Uruguay, the different competing associations, and how in Sao Paulo, when Brazil got knocked out by, I think it was Yugoslavia, there was massive celebrations in the street because Rio had lost, not because Brazil had lost. But I'm going to go with, and this guy apparently, I don't think he was involved in the shootouts with, which casted the Sundance Kid, but Luis Reyes Penaranda, who played for Bolivia. And it took him 4 days to travel by train from his home to get to Uruguay. And he got to the border and they turned him around because his papers weren't in order. So he actually had to go all the way back. But as it happened, Bolivia lost both games 4-0, so he probably had a lucky escape. I will just sort of throw in one. It's an interesting one. I mean, it's not particularly funny, which is interesting. John Langenis, the Brazilian referee of the first World Cup final, he was a journalist as well, and he penned a book on his travels in 1942, and it was officially the first football referee autobiography.
I tell you what, I might throw in a secondary, almost like a Europa League competition, where you can play for the most interesting fact of each episode as well.
I'll take any trophy I'll get, mate.
We might have to flip a coin for it, but I'm pretty sure you'll be happy with that anyway. Stephen, you're next.
There are multiple ones to pick from here. I mean, Pete mentioned the one about the Argentinian supporters setting sail for the final and sailing into fog, and many of them not making it to the final at all, which I just think is absolutely spectacular. Absolutely spectacular. Did consider that one, and yeah, it's a toss of a coin, and I'm gonna have to go for Alfred Ferreira of
It's a
Romania.
strong contender just for the pronunciation. I'm not going to lie.
Absolutely, Alfred.
That's easy for you to say.
Ferreira, I think we'll call him. Took ill on the way home. Came down pneumonia, or something like that. Anyway, and as the ship stopped in Genoa, they left him there to recuperate in the nice sunshine and the nice conditions. And as Romania returned home, no one thought to inform his family of where he was, and as the lack of him being there as they got home, the rumour spread that he died in South America, and this got back to his mother, who decided to, in a desperation to throw a wake in his honour, that she was never even going to get his son's body back, and on the very day of the wake, her son tipped up as a surprise guest at his own funeral.
I'm just making
thus
a note
almost
of this.
killing his mother through shock. almost killing his mother through shock.
Well, that wouldn't have wasted the buffet, I suppose. But it's great anecdote. That's a long anecdote, but it's a great one as well. The return of the ghost. Okay, Pete, it's tough competition this week, and you're already behind.
I mean, I've actually got. I mean, I think I could practically do one about all 13 nations, but I think no one's got the patience for that. So, I mean, the one I'm gonna really go for. My first choice one is also Bolivia related, and it relates to the referee who actually gave the 5 penalties that we already talked about. But he's actually famous for something else. His name's Salcedo. He kind of was a Bolivian referee and also acted as their coach. But he'd actually played in England the year before, and apparently is reported of being a kind of a great goal scorer for the mighty Billericay, and managed to get 4 goals in one game against Roxwell in the Cheshire and District Division 3. So Bolivia, yeah, well,
Billericay, Cheshire.
This is what it says. I don't think it's. I mean, this is from the World Cup 1930 project. So blame Dean Lockyer. This is what I said. That's what it comes from. Anyway, so there's that fact. That's my favourite fact. A couple of other quick ones just to throw in is that one of the Paraguayan players and one of the Bolivian players, a couple of years later, Bolivia and Paraguay were actually at war in the Chaco War. And Aurelio Ramon González Benítez, who was one of the kind of Paraguayan soldiers, had kind of captured a whole load of Bolivian ones. And then he realised that Niato Mendes was someone who had played the Bolivian captain in the World Cup, and they embraced each other when they met. So just a couple of years later, they met fighting, but actually kind of, hugged each other. So there's another love one. I mean, another one is Belgium were the only team that didn't have a flag for their procession at the opening because they'd forgotten to bring it from Brussels. There's so many. I mean,
they're the sort I love.
Yeah, I do have one for each country, but we're running long, so I'll just leave it as those 3. But again, for more, have a look at the World Cup 1930.
I should have mentioned my guy also fought in the Chaco War and was awarded medals for his in the Chaco War. Yeah,
fantastic. I was going to say I'll throw one more Bolivian one into the mix. When they played Brazil, they both tipped up with white shirts. So this was 2022. Well, the goalkeepers aside, everyone in a white shirt for the first half. The only differential was that half of the Bolivian players were wearing berets, and they eventually came back for the second half in red shirts.
Bolivia actually didn't effectively were kind of almost wearing Uruguayan colours in both games, because in the first game they turned up with, each of them had a letter that spelt out Viva Uruguay on their shirts. So Bolivia didn't actually manage to wear their own kind of, national colours in either of their two games for the full game. So
I'm sure I'm really even more convinced that my guy was delighted when they turned his papers up at the board and sent him back home.
All I've taken from that, fellas, is one, I keep thinking you're calling them the taco wars, which makes me think of two vendors on a street corner having an argument. And the second one is, I'm really disappointed that Bolivia didn't end up playing in skins. They're the only two things that I've taken from that. However, I will sit and deliberate. I've got to say the Belgian flag thing is by far the best one that they just forgot.
Oops.
Yeah. Where is it? And the blame that goes round the entire group of whose fault it was.
I thought you brought it, Pierre.
You were supposed to bring the flag.
No, it was Henri.
You had one job.
Yeah.
It's just sitting on the train platform at Brussels Central Station, platform 5.
Steve, it was in the prop bag.
It's a prop bag, yeah.
I can just imagine someone being dead quiet all the way there when they'd realised they'd forgotten the flag and hoped no one would notice until it got to the opening ceremony. But yeah, the flag one's brilliant. Anyway, but I will deliberate on those over the week and let you know. But it will be the Belgian flag, I'm not going to lie, because I'm just going to imagine the conversation all of this week. Guys, thank you. Gary, enjoyed that trip through 6 years of football?
I've never had so much fun on a podcast as the South America Files, and here we go again. Look, plenty of fun, plenty of knowledge particularly from Pete, of course, and it's barrel laughs as well. I mean, great fun. Yeah, loved it. Massively.
Excellent. Stephen, you happy with your five-a-side choices?
Absolutely, I am. If I don't win all 5 of these categories, then I'll be absolutely gutted.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And Pete, as always, absolutely fascinating to listen to. It, like I say, it just so much light, managed to throw so much light on these things, even just with the detail and the backstory. And yeah, it's, like I said, I find it fascinating. Even if I do get sidetracked by the Jetsons and Stephen's face as to what are we talking about next week, and realising he should be paying more attention. Do you want? Oh, this is where you get to give us a clue about next week's episode. I feel like you've given us loads, and I've still not picked up on them.
Yeah, no, we mentioned a few. I think just as well, just to say, it's standing on the shoulder of the giants here. There's some great historians and writers and people who put a lot of time and effort.
I'm not talking about Oasis.
I was going to one last chance for puns as we finish the episode. So next week, we're kind of moving on in time, and what clue can we give here? I guess we're going to just give you the names of what they're called. We're going to talk about Oriundi and Rimpatriati. So that's the kind of aim, and they're the topics. So if you know what those are, then you'll know. If you don't, well, you've got to try and spell it to look it up, or otherwise we'll just tell you next week.
Pete was looking at me when he said that.
Yeah. We'll get an email, Stephen, don't worry. We'll get the email prompt halfway through the week about what we're talking about and the links that we need to go to do the research.
Next week he's bringing a blackboard duster, isn't he? We're going to have to duck, Stu. Yeah. We're going to have to duck.
There's going to be some chalk thrown our way. Guys, as always, just absolutely brilliant. Join us next week for episode 4 of Encounters, and who knows what it'll be about, but I'm dead excited. And I will let you know the result of the anecdote of the week, which is the Belgian flag, not going to lie. And I will decide, as we've been talking about Jules Rimet and the first World Cup, whether or not I'm going to create the secondary club competition that will be best fact. So yeah, I'll let you know if that competition is coming into play or not next week. But guys, thank you so much. As always, just the best way to spend an evening. Thank you and goodbye.